The city air was different here. It wasn't the warm, dusty air of her neighborhood, filled with the smell of food from the local restaurants and the sound of children playing. This air was cold, sharp, and clean, pumped through invisible vents in a building that looked like it was made entirely of glass and light. She stood on the pavement, looking up, and the towering structure seemed to swallow the sky. Her name was Elena, and she felt very small. In her hand, she clutched the case of her violin. It was an old case, scuffed at the corners from years of travel, covered with stickers from music festivals and cities she had played in. It felt familiar and solid in her grasp, a piece of her real world in this strange new one. She took a deep breath of that cold, clean air and walked towards the giant spinning doors. Inside, the lobby was even more immense than she had imagined. The ceiling was so high it felt like a cathedral. The floor was made of a shiny, dark stone that reflected the lights from above. There were no papers, no clutter, no signs of real life, just a vast, silent space. The only sound was the quiet hum of electricity and the soft clicks of her own shoes. On the stone floor, she felt like everyone could hear her, an intruder making noise in a world of silence. A young man in a sharp, dark suit was waiting for her. He looked like all the other people moving quietly through the lobby, perfect, polished, and busy. But this one was her friend. Or, he used to be her friend. They had gone to school together, a lifetime ago. Before he had stepped into this world of glass and suits. "Elena, you made it," he said, his voice a little too loud for the quiet lobby. He gave her a quick, tense smile. He looked different. His face was thinner, his eyes darting around, not quite meeting hers for more than a second. He used to be the boy who would laugh until he cried at silly jokes. Now, he looked like a man who carried the weight of the world on his shoulders. "Of course," Elena said, trying to sound more confident than she felt. "You said it was important." "It is. It really is," he said, lowering his voice as he guided her away from the main lobby. "Come on, we need to talk before we go up." He led her to a small private room off to the side. It was just as clean and impersonal as the lobby, with a single white table and 2 chairs. He closed the door, and the silence became even thicker. "Look," he started, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair. "I need to be straight with you. This isn't a normal performance." "I didn't think it was," Elena replied, placing her violin case gently on the table. "You said it was for a company leadership retreat." "It is. But it's complicated." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. "The boss, the man who runs this whole company, he's a different kind of person. He's a genius, a millionaire many times over. He built all of this from nothing." He gestured around him, at the invisible building around them. "But he doesn't believe in anything he can't measure. Data, numbers, profits, that's his religion. Things like music, art, emotions. He thinks they're a waste of time, soft, unnecessary." Elena listened, a knot tightening in her stomach. "Then why hire a musician?" "That's the thing," her friend said, a strange, almost guilty look flashing in his eyes. "He didn't. I did. This retreat, the theme is the human element. It's all about creativity and connection and all that stuff. He hates the idea. He thinks it's nonsense. So, some of us, we thought we'd give him a nudge. A nudge. Yeah, you see, if we present something that he sees as purely frivolous, like a live violin performance in the middle of a serious business meeting, it will prove his point. It will show him how silly this whole human element theme really is. He'll get annoyed, scrap the idea, and we can get back to business as usual for a moment." Elena just stared at him. The words took a second to sink in. They didn't want her music to inspire or to move anyone. They wanted her to be a prop, a joke. They were bringing her in to be laughed at, or worse, ignored just to make a point to their boss. The knot in her stomach turned into a cold stone. She felt a flush of anger rise to her cheeks. She had spent 20 years of her life with this instrument. She had practiced for hours every day, her fingers sore, her neck aching. She had poured her joy, her sadness, her entire soul into this music. And they wanted to use it as a weapon in their office politics. "You want me to be your provocation?" she asked, her voice quiet, but steady. Her friend must have seen the hurt in her eyes. He looked away, uncomfortable. "It's not like that. It's a strategy. And the pay is very good. I made sure of it. It's triple your usual rate." He mentioned a number. It was a lot of money. It was more than she made from 3 months of teaching students and playing at small events. With that money, she could finally get her violin properly serviced. She could pay her rent for months without worry. She could help her family. The practical part of her brain wrestled with the proud, artistic part. The proud part wanted to pick up her case, tell her old friend exactly what she thought of his strategy, and walk right out of that cold, shiny building. but the practical part remembered the stack of bills on her kitchen table. She looked down at her violin case. The stickers were faded. One was from a music camp she went to when she was 15, full of dreams. Another was from a concert hall where she had played her first solo, her heart pounding with fear and excitement. This case held her history. Was she really going to let them use it for this? She took a slow, deep breath. So, let me get this straight, she said, looking back at her friend. I go in there. I play one piece. You don't care what I play. I get paid. And that's it. That's it, he said, relief washing over his face. You just have to be there. You're the example. The unnecessary human touch. Elena nodded slowly. The decision was made. The money was too important to walk away from. But a new, quiet determination was settling inside her. They thought her music was unnecessary. They thought it was soft. They saw it as a simple tool. But they were wrong. She wasn't just going to be their example. If she had to play, she would play something real. Something so powerful and full of human element that it couldn't be ignored. She wouldn't play a light, pretty tune that could be easily dismissed. She would play something that had weight, something that had soul. Okay, she said finally. I'll do it. Her friend's shoulders slumped with relief. Great, thank you so much. You're a lifesaver. He checked his watch. They're about to break for the session. We should head up. He led her out of the room and towards a bank of elevators. The doors slid open without a sound. They stepped inside, and the elevator began to rise, so fast and smooth that her ears popped. She watched the numbers flash by on the screen, each one taking her higher and further away from the world she knew. She thought about the piece she would play. It wasn't a happy piece. It wasn't a piece designed to please. It was a piece by Bach, the Chaconne. It was a piece built from a simple, repeating bass line. But it grew into something immense. It was a story told without words, a story of deep sorrow, of struggle, of searching for light, and finally, of a hard-won triumph. It was technically demanding, one of the most difficult pieces ever written for a solo violin. But more than that, it was emotionally devastating. It was pure, raw feeling poured into notes. Asterisk, the doors opened onto a different kind of silence. It wasn't the vast, empty silence of the lobby. This was a thick, heavy quiet, pressed down by the weight of money and importance. The carpet was so deep and soft it swallowed all sound. The walls were a muted gray, and on one side, a huge window looked out over the entire city, the buildings below looking like tiny toys. Her friend led her down a hallway, his footsteps making no noise. He was straightening his tie, his face a mask of nervous energy. He glanced back at her, giving a tight, quick smile that didn't reach his eyes. Just remember, he whispered, it's just a formality. In and out. They stopped before a large, imposing door made of a dark, polished wood. He paused, his hand on the handle, and took a deep breath. For a moment, he looked like the boy she used to know, scared before a big test. Then he pushed the door open. The room was long, dominated by a massive, sleek table that looked like a single piece of carved stone. Around it sat about 20 people, all dressed in the same uniform of expensive, dark suits. The air was cool, smelling faintly of coffee and expensive perfume. At the far end of the table, facing the door, sat a man. Elena knew instantly this was the leader. The millionaire. He wasn't looking at them. He was staring down at a tablet in his hands, his brow furrowed in concentration. He was younger than she had imagined, but his face had a tired, stern look, as if he carried a constant, heavy burden. He didn't bother to look up when they entered. The message was clear. Whatever was happening was an interruption. A few of the other people at the table glanced their way. Their faces were polite, blank, but she saw a flicker of curiosity, and in a few, something else, a subtle amusement, as if they were in on the joke. Her friend's joke. Everyone, her friend said, his voice sounding too bright and fake in the quiet room. As a brief interlude for our human element discussion, we have a small musical presentation. This is a violinist. He didn't even use her name. She was just a violinist. A prop, just as he had said. He gestured for her to stand in a clear space at the side of the room, near the giant window. The city sprawled beneath her, a breathtaking view that none of the people in the room seemed to notice. She walked to the spot, her heart hammering against her ribs. She could feel every eye in the room on her, not with anticipation, but with a detached, clinical interest. She was an experiment. She was the mouse in the maze. She carefully unlatched the old, scuffed case and lifted her violin. The wood, warm and familiar, felt like an old friend in her hands. She tightened the bow, the simple, practiced motion calming her nerves just a little. She looked out at the sea of faces. Most were waiting, some were already looking bored. One man was subtly checking his phone under the table. The leader, Julian Thorne, finally looked up from his tablet. He didn't look annoyed or angry. He looked blank. His eyes met hers for a second, devoid of any interest, and then went back to his screen. He was waiting for this nonsense to be over so he could get back to his important numbers. This was the moment. This was when she was supposed to play some pleasant, forgettable tune that would confirm all their beliefs. She could play something light and sweet. It would be easy. She would get her money and leave. But as she stood there, feeling the weight of their indifference, something in her rebelled. The anger from downstairs had cooled into a solid, firm resolve. They thought her life's work was a joke. They thought the human spirit, poured into music over centuries, was a soft skill. No, she raised the violin to her chin and settled it there. A movement as natural to her as breathing. She closed her eyes for a second, shutting out the room, the suits, the arrogant leader. She thought of the music. Not the notes on a page, but the story it told. A story of loss, of walking through a long, dark night, of searching for a single star in the blackness. She drew the bow across the strings. The first notes of Bach's Chaconne were not loud, but they were dense and heavy, like stones dropping into the still water of the room. It was a simple, repeating bass line, a foundation. The sound was not pretty. It was profound. It was serious. The change in the atmosphere was immediate, almost physical. The man who was checking his phone froze, his hands still in his pocket. The subtle whispers of shifting in chairs stopped dead. The air itself seemed to grow still, charged with the sound. Elena kept playing, her body moving with the music. This was not just a performance. It was a physical effort. Her fingers flew across the strings, pressing and dancing. Her bow arms sawed back and forth, creating a storm of sound from a single instrument. The music began to build, layer upon layer, growing from that simple, sad foundation into something complex and powerful. It was sorrow, but it was also a fierce, stubborn strength. It was the sound of someone refusing to be broken. She opened her eyes for a moment, and her gaze fell on Julian Thorne. He was no longer looking at his tablet. His screen had gone dark. He was staring at her, but not at her face. He was staring at her hands, at the furious, precise dance of her fingers on the fingerboard. His expression was no longer blank. It was one of intense, almost confused concentration. It was as if he was trying to solve a complex problem, a math equation he had never seen before. His head was tilted slightly, his body rigid in his chair. The music swelled, filling every corner of the soundproofed room. It was a tide of emotion. Wave after wave of it, there was anguish in the high, crying notes, and a deep, grounding resilience in the low ones. It was a conversation between despair and hope, happening right there in front of them. And then she saw it. A slight, almost imperceptible change in the leader's face. His stern mouth, usually set in a firm line, softened just a little. His eyes, which had been so cold and analytical, seemed to lose their focus for a second. They grew shiny, reflecting the light from the window. He blinked quickly and looked away, turning his head to stare out at the cityscape. But it was too late. She had seen it. The millionaire leader, the man who built an empire on data, the man who thought human emotion was a useless variable, had been moved. A single, tiny crack had appeared in his wall of certainty. Elena poured everything she had into the final minutes of the piece. The music became a triumphant climb, a struggle upwards towards the light. It wasn't a happy ending. Not exactly. It was a victory earned through pain. It was the sound of survival. When she played the final, powerful note, she let it ring in the silent room until the last vibration faded from the string. Then, there was nothing. A silence so complete it was louder than the music had been. No one moved. No one clapped. No one knew what to do. The executives looked at each other, then at their boss, completely lost. The provocation had worked, but it had done something they never expected. It hadn't made him angry. It had silenced him. It had, for a few minutes, made him human. Elena slowly lowered her violin and bow. Her heart was still pounding, but now from the effort and the emotion of the piece. She stood there, breathing heavily, surrounded by a quiet she did not understand. The spell was finally broken by a single, slow, soft clap from the end of the table. It was Julian Thorne. He wasn't looking at her. He was still gazing out the window, but his hands were coming together in a slow, deliberate, and utterly solitary applause. The sound of that single pair of hands clapping was the only thing in the room. It wasn't loud or excited. It was slow, thoughtful, like the ticking of a clock in a quiet house. Each clap echoed in the silence, and everyone watched, frozen, as the leader continued this strange, solitary applause. He did it maybe 5 or 6 times, and then he stopped. He dropped his hands back to the table, his eyes still fixed on something far away beyond the window. The spell was broken, and the rest of the people in the room seemed to remember they had lungs. A wave of soft, uncertain clapping rippled around the table. It was polite, confused, and quickly died out. They were all looking at him, waiting for a signal, for an explanation of what had just happened. He gave them none. Instead, he pushed his chair back. The sound of the legs scraping against the floor was harsh in the quiet room. He stood up, his movement slow, almost heavy. He didn't look at anyone, not at his executives, not at Elena's friend, whose face had gone pale. He just turned and walked towards the door that led to his private office, which was connected to the conference room. He opened the door, stepped inside, and closed it behind him with a soft, but very final click. The room was left in a state of suspended animation. The executives looked at each other, their faces a mixture of confusion and mild panic. What were they supposed to do now? The boss had just walked out of his own leadership retreat. The carefully planned schedule for the day was suddenly meaningless. The human element had just blown a hole right through it. Elena stood by the window, her violin feeling heavy in her damp hands. The rush of the performance was fading, leaving behind a hollow, shaky feeling. She carefully placed her instrument back in its case, her fingers trembling as she latched it shut. The action felt loud in the quiet room. Her friend finally moved, walking over to her quickly. He looked completely lost. I don't know what to say, he whispered, his voice tight. That wasn't. What was that? It was Bach, Elena said simply, her own voice sounding rough. He just left, her friend said, stating the obvious, his mind clearly racing through the professional consequences. He didn't say anything. Just then, a woman who seemed to be the most senior person in the room stood up. All right, everyone, she announced, her voice strained but trying to sound in control. Let's take an early break. 15 minutes. We'll reconvene. The room erupted into a low buzz of conversation as people stood up, gathering their notebooks and phones. They moved in small groups, their voices hushed, casting frequent glances towards the closed office door. No one looked at Elena. She had become invisible again, her purpose served. But the result was something no one had planned for. Her friend was called over by a small group of worried-looking men. He gave Elena an apologetic look. Just wait here for a second, okay? Don't leave. She nodded, and he hurried off to join the huddle. She was left alone by the giant window, the case at her feet. She felt like a stone that had been thrown into a pond, and now she was just sitting at the bottom, watching the strange, turbulent waves she had created ripple out above her. She looked out at the city. From up here, the people were invisible. The cars were tiny, silent specks. It was all just shapes and patterns, like a diagram. She understood, in that moment, how the leader must see the world most of the time. A vast, complicated system of data points and flows. Her music wasn't a data point. It was a storm, and it had crashed into his system, after what felt like a long time. The door to the private office opened again. Everyone in the room immediately fell silent. Mid-conversation, turning to look, the leader stepped out. His face was unreadable. He had composed himself, the brief moment of vulnerability completely gone, replaced by his usual stern mask. But he looked tired. His eyes scanned the room, and then landed directly on Elena. He began walking towards her. The crowd of executives parted for him like the sea. No one spoke. You could have heard a pin drop on the deep carpet. He walked right past his nervous employees, his focus entirely on the woman with the violin case. He stopped a few feet in front of her. He was taller than she had realized up close. He didn't smile. He just looked at her, his gaze intense and searching. What was that? He asked. His voice was quiet, but it carried in the silent room. It wasn't an angry question. It was a genuine one. He needed to know. Elena's throat felt dry. It's called a Chaconne, she said, by Johann Sebastian Bach. It's from a partita for solo violin. He processed this, his eyes never leaving hers. What is it about? The question surprised her. No one had ever asked her that after a performance. They usually said beautiful or impressive. She thought for a moment, choosing her words carefully. It's not about a specific story, she began. It's a feeling. It's about facing something very difficult, something that causes great sorrow. And then, you keep walking. You carry the weight of it, and you find a way to keep going. It's about the struggle itself. The music. It builds and builds. It's the sound of a human spirit trying to survive. He listened, truly listened, to every word. He nodded slowly, just once. He looked down at her violin case, at the old, faded stickers. He seemed to be seeing it for the first time, not as an object, but as a container for the powerful thing he had just experienced. He looked back at her. I have no data for that, he said, almost to himself. Then to her he said, thank you. He didn't thank her for playing. He didn't thank her for the performance. He simply said, thank you for the disruption, for the new, unmeasurable variable. Then he turned to the room. His eyes swept over his waiting team, and finally to the woman who had called the break. "Cancel the rest of the afternoon sessions," he said, his voice back to its normal, commanding tone. "I need to think." And with that, he turned and walked back into his office, closing the door once more, leaving everyone, including Elena, standing in the wake of a quiet revolution they did not yet understand. The silence in the conference room didn't last long. The moment the office door clicked shut for the second time, the quiet broke into a low, frantic hum of whispers. It was like a beehive that had been knocked over. People huddled together, their eyes wide, speaking in hushed, urgent tones. The carefully planned retreat had completely fallen apart, and no one knew what to do next. Elena stood by her violin case, feeling completely out of place. Her part in the strange play was over, but she had no idea how to exit the stage. She just wanted to go home, to her own small apartment with its familiar smells and sounds, far away from this world of glass and anxiety. Her friend finally broke away from a worried-looking group and hurried over to her. His face was a mixture of awe and pure fear. "I can't believe that just happened," he whispered, pulling her slightly away from the main group. "He canceled the entire afternoon. He's never done that, ever." "I'm sorry," Elena said, though she wasn't entirely sure what she was apologizing for. "Don't be sorry," he said, his voice still a hushed exclamation. I don't know what that was. It was supposed to be a simple thing, a little joke, but you played something else. You played truth." He looked at her, and for the first time that day, he seemed to really see her, not as his old-school friend or a pawn in his plan, but as the musician she was. The guilt was clear on his face. "Look," he said, digging into his pocket and pulling out his wallet. He took out a thick stack of crisp bills. "Here, your payment. Just take it. I think you should probably go. I'll call you later, okay?" He pressed the money into her hand. It felt heavy and real. She nodded, grateful for the escape route. She didn't need to be told twice. She picked up her violin case, holding it tightly, and made her way towards the door. The executives barely noticed her leaving. They were too absorbed in dissecting the boss's unexpected reaction, trying to figure out what it meant for their jobs, for the company, for everything. The ride down in the elevator felt like emerging from deep underwater. The pressure of the room above faded, replaced by the simple, mechanical hum of the descent. When the doors opened onto the vast, quiet lobby, she felt like she could breathe properly again. She walked out of the building and into the late afternoon light. The city sounds rushed back in the honking of cars, the distant siren, the chatter of people on the pavement. It was noisy, and messy, and real. It was a relief. She walked to the nearest bus stop, the envelope of money feeling like a secret in her pocket. She didn't feel triumphant. She felt drained, and strangely sad. The music had done its work. It had touched something in that powerful, isolated man. But it had also exposed the hollow game her friend was playing. It felt like she had used something very pure in a place that didn't understand it. Back in the skyscraper, the leader sat in his office. The lights were off, the only illumination coming from the city sprawling beyond his window. He sat in his chair, not behind his desk, but off to the side, staring out at the countless windows of other buildings, each one a tiny box containing other lives, other struggles. His tablet lay on the desk, dark and silent. For the first time in years, he had no desire to look at it. The numbers and graphs felt meaningless. He kept hearing the music. It was stuck in his head, a loop of that powerful, sorrowful melody. He kept seeing the musician's hands, moving with such certainty and strength. He kept feeling that unexpected tightness in his chest, the prickle in his eyes that had forced him to look away. "I have no data for that." His own words echoed in his mind. He had built his entire life, his entire empire, on a foundation of data. He believed that everything could be measured, analyzed, and optimized. People were collections of behaviors, markets were sets of trends, problems were equations to be solved. But that music, what was it? It was just vibrations in the air, created by horsehair scraping against metal strings. By all logical measures, it was frivolous. It produced nothing. It solved no immediate problem. It generated no direct profit. And yet, it had done something to him. It had bypassed his brain and spoken directly to something else, something deeper and older. It had made him feel a profound sense of, what, loss? Resilience? It was a feeling he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a very long time. The feeling of being a person, just a person, carrying a weight. He thought about the human element theme of the retreat. He had approved it reluctantly, seeing it as a soft, trendy concept that good employees expected to hear about. He hadn't believed in it for a second. But now he wondered, was that music the human element? Was it the part of us that can't be graphed? The part that suffers, that endures, that creates beauty not for a purpose but because it must. He stood up and walked to the window, placing his hand against the cool glass. Down below, the city teemed with life, with millions of stories, millions of struggles and triumphs that would never show up on a spreadsheet. He had always looked down from this height and seen a system. Now, for a fleeting moment, he wondered if he was looking at a masterpiece. A chaotic, messy, and incredibly beautiful masterpiece. He didn't have an answer. The certainty that usually guided him was gone, replaced by a quiet, unsettling, but not entirely unpleasant, confusion. The musician had given him a problem he didn't know how to solve. And for a man who lived for solving problems, that was the most intriguing thing of all. He made a decision. He walked back to his desk, pressed a button on his intercom, and spoke to his assistant. "Cancel my meetings for the next 2 hours," he said, "and get me the personnel file for the violinist who played today. I need her name." The days that followed felt strange to Elena. Like the world had returned to its normal colors but was somehow dimmer. She deposited the money in the bank. The numbers in her account a solid, comforting fact. She paid her bills. She got her violin serviced, the luthier commenting on the beautiful wear of the wood. Life went on, but a quiet unease stayed with her. She thought often about the man in the glass tower. She wondered if the music had haunted him the way it haunted her, or if the moment had passed for him as quickly as it had begun, forgotten in the rush of his important life. She wondered if her friend had gotten into trouble. He had sent her one text, still employed, still confused. Talk soon. They hadn't spoken since. Then, 3 weeks after the performance, a thick, heavy envelope arrived in her mailbox. It wasn't a normal bill or advertisement. It was made of a rich, creamy paper, and her name and address were written on it in a sharp, precise handwriting. There was no return address. With a curious heart, she took it upstairs to her apartment, sat at her small kitchen table, and carefully opened it. Inside was a single sheet of the same expensive paper, and a check. The check was for a sum that made her breath catch. It was more than the already generous fee she had been paid. It was a life-changing amount of money. Her eyes moved from the check to the letter. The handwriting was the same as on the envelope, clean, sharp, and without a single mistake. It read, "I have spent the past weeks attempting to analyze the dataset you presented. The variables are complex and do not fit into any model I know. The impact, however, was measurable. It caused a disruption in my thinking that was both inefficient and necessary. You were asked to perform a simple task. You chose instead to perform a complex one. You presented a truth I had no algorithm to process. Thank you for the disruption. The enclosed is not a payment. It is an investment in the continued creation of datasets that challenge my own." It was signed with a single, initialed name, the leader's. Elena read the letter 3 times. The words were so formal, so cold in a way, and yet she understood the profound meaning hidden within them. Thank you for the disruption. That was his way of saying thank you for shaking his world. An investment. That was his way of saying her art had value. A value he was only just beginning to understand. She held the check in her hand. It wasn't just paper. It was freedom. It was time. Time to compose, to practice, to teach students who couldn't afford to pay, without worrying how she would pay her own rent. It was a validation she had never expected to receive from such a source. She felt a slow smile spread across her face. It wasn't a smile of triumph, but of a quiet, deep satisfaction. The seed had been planted. In the towering office, the leader sat at his desk. The check had been sent. The letter had been written. The strange, unresolved equation of the music was still with him, but it no longer troubled him. It sat in a corner of his mind, a quiet, persistent reminder that his map of the world was incomplete. A few days later, he was in a meeting with his top team discussing a new project. The room was filled with charts and graphs projected on the wall. The conversation was about market penetration and user engagement metrics. One of his executives, the same one who had brought in the violinist as a provocation, was speaking. He was laying out a plan, a cynical but data-backed strategy to undermine a competitor. The leader listened, his fingers steepled. The plan was logical. The numbers added up. It was, by all accounts, a good plan, but then he heard an echo of the music in his mind. The part where it struggles, searching for a higher path. He held up a hand, stopping the presentation. The room went quiet. "Explain to me," the leader said, his voice calm but firm. "The human cost of this strategy." The executive blinked. "The human cost, sir?" "Yes," the leader said. "What is the emotional impact on the users we are trying to migrate? What is the ethical weight of this approach? Factor that into your model." The room was stunned into silence. They looked at each other, bewildered. They had never heard him ask a question like that. He was the one who always demanded harder, faster, more efficient results. Regardless of the collateral damage, the executive stammered, "Well, sir, our data doesn't really. We don't have metrics for that." "Then find some," the leader said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Or design a new strategy that doesn't require me to ask the question." He didn't call it the check-on principle. He would never say something so sentimental out loud. But that's what it was. It was the understanding that some things, resonance, integrity, the human spirit, were real. Even if they couldn't be measured, they were variables that had to be respected. The story of the violinist became a quiet legend in the company. It was whispered in the hallways and around the coffee machines. No one knew the whole story, but they knew something had changed. The boss was still demanding, still a perfectionist, but a new dimension had been added. He would occasionally, and unpredictably, ask the one question no one was prepared for: "But is it right?" The crack that the music had made in his certainty did not break him. It let the light in. It made him, in a small but significant way, more whole. Elena never played for the company again. She didn't need to. She used the money to build the life she wanted, a life centered around her music. But sometimes, when she was practicing late at night, the powerful notes of the chaconne filling her small apartment, she would think of the man in the glass tower. She had not changed the world, but she had changed one man, and that man, in his own small way, began to change the world around him. It was a ripple, started by a single, resonant note in a room that had been built for silence. The provocation had failed, but the music had succeeded, and in the end, the music was all that mattered.